So we're in the final, this is the last announcement for the semester. We're up, way up at the top there. I can't reach that high to Tuesday, December 10th. Today and tomorrow we have regular class. This week we have our final mini practical on the brain. That's in lab this week. Next week you have your exam, and that's our last exam. One of the things that I'm going to do in this last exam is, so it's only got 100 questions, and what you'll experience down at URI or elsewhere at any other college is a limited time to take an exam. So that's the next level that people are experiencing. So oftentimes my son complains about having 35 questions and 40 minutes to do the exam. And
That's
he's like, they're worth so many points, so you get one wrong and it's like, I got a B already. And I was like, yeah, that's the way it is. So what I'm going to do for this last exam is I'm going to start the exam at a certain time. I'm going to say you're going to have 50 minutes. Now, wait a minute, before you get freaked out, I'm going to give you 50 minutes and I'm going to put a timer on. And I'm going to say, out of 100 questions, how many questions, assuming everything's correct, how many questions would you have gotten correct? Or have you finished in 50 minutes? Because that's the next level of detail that I give you guys the opportunity to go beyond. I give you guys plenty of time to take the exam, unlimited time to take the exam. After that 50 minutes, I'm gonna want you to record the number. So if you're at number 50, if you're at number 75, or whatever it is, I want you to take note of that, because in the future, you're gonna have that time limitation. And then we'll continue the exam. So the exam's gonna remain unchanged as far as this semester is concerned, but that's another added level of help that I'm giving you guys, and I do that on purpose. So that's there. So now next week, there's an open lab on Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So that means that if you're here, you're gonna be alone, because I'm not gonna be here. So I will be at Rhinai, and I will be giving anyone access to the lab on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And then next week, again during your normal lab time, you have the full practical. That full practical is a cumulative practical. Everything that we did this semester is on it. Okay? Any questions about that? So, let's see how things go today. I want to see if this pointer works. Let's see. So in terms of today's lecture, it should be continuous in some way, shape, or form with the other lecture, with yesterday's lecture, because what I did was I combined the parts of 3 chapters into one lecture series, and that's this part right here. So the first part was the somatic nervous system and sensory structures that we talked about yesterday. The second part is relatively simple to talk about, but it's incredibly complicated because it has so many impacts to your overall body and well-being. And so you need to, the autonomic nervous system can have impact everywhere in our body without us knowing it. So the name auto meaning automatic or without consciousness. The nervous system is divided into 2 general categories here. And this diagram right here illustrates one of those 2 general categories. And there's a couple of different ways of talking about these things. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about is where the impact is felt by these nervous system. So that you have to understand, remember back in exam 1 when I started talking about the functions of those various systems and individual organs. So it's at this point in this class when I can start asking you, what is the impact of the autonomic system on the digestive system, or the urinary system, or the circulatory system? And we'll get to that today. So the autonomic nervous system largely is broken up into 2 different groups. There's a parasympathetic and a sympathetic. parasympathetic is called the rest and digest, or the craniosacral. So typically, I use the word craniosacral, as you might imagine, in my questions here, and not necessarily the rest and digest system. Sympathetic division is the fight or flight, or the thoracolumbar. And if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you should automatically see the two parts of the two systems here. So if you look at the first one, where my pointer is, the craniosacral division. Cranial refers to cranial nerves. So give me some examples of cranial nerves. Oh, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4 cranial nerves that are right there. So this is, on the left-hand side, part of the parasympathetic division. And then the second part of that portion is the sacral division. So the craniosacral is on the left, and the thoracolumbar is on the right. Thoracolumbar in blue, the craniosacral in red. It's also important to recognize that there are special, specific cranial nerves that are impacting the parasympathetic division. Those same cranial nerves do not impact the sacral, the sympathetic division. That's not entirely true, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but generally speaking, the sympathetic division is not impacted by the cranial nerves, or interacting with the cranial nerves. So it's just a bigger picture of that. And if you look at this long line right here, this long line right there is when we were talking about the spinal cord, right? We talked about the sympathetic chain. So on the right-hand side is a sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and that right there is the sympathetic chain. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the overall structure of the autonomic nervous system generally, and then talk about the specifics of it. So first of all, when you talk about the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, all we're trying to do is figure out a way to maintain homeostasis. And again, another thing about from Unit 1 is negative feedback. So this is basically a negative feedback loop. If it goes too high, then something has to, you've got to cause that thing to decrease. If it goes too low, you got to cause that structure to increase. If it's body temperature, if it's respiration rate, if it's heart rate, if it's digestion rate, all of those things are governed by negative feedback. In terms of the system itself, the autonomic nervous system receives information from both the visceral and the somatic sensory divisions. And so those sensory structures we talked about yesterday are directly related to what the information received by the autonomic nervous system, regardless of whether it's the parasympathetic or the sympathetic division. So there are all these examples of signals that are being sent to the main body there, so ranging from heart rate to breathing to urinary functions and so on. All of those things are governed by the autonomic nervous system. So when I mentioned that the autonomic nervous system is far-reaching, this is just sort of a touching of sort of very brief example of how wide-reaching they are. The ANS is getting all this information from these sensory structures here, so all these visceral and somatic sensory structures, and then they're acting on them. And when, just like we talked about already, we talked about the motor division here. The motor division falls into two different categories, regardless of whether they're motor nerves in the visceral motor nerves or somatic motor nerves. The only distinction there is that it's going to skeletal muscle, or the type of structure we're talking about. So if it's going to skeletal muscle, it's somatic motor nerves, and if it's cardiac or smooth, generally speaking, that's not entirely true, and then glands, it's visceral motor or autonomic motor. In addition, the glands that I'm generally ignoring right now are endocrine glands, and those are large. Those take place. They act over much longer times. There's three. I told you that there's two main parts of the ANS. That's the sympathetic or the parasympathetic divisions. But there's also the enteric nervous system, and I don't really speak a lot about that. The enteric nervous system is just associated with the digestive system, and as you might, digestion is vaguely important to our overall health,
And so it's a sort of integrated within the autonomic nervous system. Let's start with the first of these two divisions here, the sympathetic division. So the sympathetic, what I have in this diagram here is just sort of the overall nervous structure of the sympathetic divisions. Remember, and then I'll go on to its terminus, or where it ends up going. So the sympathetic of the thoracolumbar division has preganglionic cells that come off of the horns of the spinal cord, the lateral horns of the spinal cord, and generally speaking, it's the thoracic, lumbar, thoracic and some lumbar vertebrae. Why isn't it lower down than the L2? Can someone tell me why it's not lower than L2 in this?
That's where the spinal cord ends.
So the spinal cord terminates there, so it can't be further deeper, lower than that, right? So there's preganglionic cell bodies, and where do these cell bodies reside? They reside in ganglion, and those ganglion, those areas, so the dorsal root ganglion is an area of cell bodies. There's other areas of cell bodies, and we talked about those in that last mini practical. There's axons then that pass through the ventral roots, and if it's passing through the ventral roots, then it's a motor axon. It's a motor neuron, and they then pass through the sympathetic chain ganglia. And that, again, that sympathetic chain ganglia is what we talked about. Again, that sympathetic chain is what we talked about a couple weeks ago. So there's the preganglionic cell bodies that are residing here. They're going to the sympathetic chain right here, and then they pass to the individual structure. So the distance from the spinal cord to the first synapse is very short in the sympathetic division. And that's very different in the parasympathetic division. The parasympathetic division, I mentioned just a little while ago that there's cranial nerves that directly relate to this. And there's these cranial nerves are coming here, the cranial nerves right there. There's 3, 7, 9, and 10. Those are the 4 main cranial nerves that are affecting that. And there's actually others as well. But these cranial nerves are going to be impacting parts of and interacting with the parasympathetic or the cranial sacral division. The preganglionic cell bodies are, again, they're part of the spinal cord, and they can either be coming from the brain directly or down in the sacral division of not necessarily the spinal cord, right, but the sacral nerves, they're S2 to S4. The terminal ganglia, what's the term terminal mean? It does not mean it's the end of the life. Here we're talking about the end of the nervous system. It's where is it innervated? It's located. The terminal ganglion is innervated or embedded in the wall of the organ. So the first main distinction here is that the two structures, these two divisions, are organized differently from a neuronic standpoint. So if you look at this comparison here, and on the left-hand side, we have the location of the preganglionic cell bodies, outflow from the CNS, in other words, motor signals here, location of the ganglia, number of ganglia, and length of the neurons. And if we just start with this one here, just look at this comparison here. The two divisions here, the first one is the sympathetic, the second one on the right-hand side is the parasympathetic. The preganglionic, postganglionic neurons, there are differently length. There's long preganglionic neurons and short postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic division, and the reverse is true in the sympathetic division. So there's differences clear right there. In terms of where the ganglia are located, they're located generally in the sympathetic division associated with the spinal cord, and the terminal in the parasympathetic division, I just said this, is adjacent to or near to the effector. The term effector right here means that where is the motor signal going to, and where is the motor signal sending information to. Outflow from the CNS, from the central nervous system, these are going to be from spinal nerves, from the sympathetic division, and largely from cranial nerves. So now, why am I just saying, but Dr. Clancy, there is also the craniosacral division here. I'm going to tell you in a minute that this nerve, the vagus nerve, is a huge portion of the parasympathetic division. So if you wanted to guess something about impact of an individual nerve on the parasympathetic division, guess the vagus nerve, or nerve number 10. And then finally, the location of the preganglionic cell bodies, you can compare those two. Right? So there's either in the brainstem or the sacral region, the thoracic and thoracolumbar areas. So now this picture right here shows the sympathetic outflow via the autonomic response, and so we're talking about this major structure right here is the sympathetic chain. We are then, there's then the ganglion right there, the individual ganglion, and then it's at this point right here where your knowledge from Unit 1 is going to come into play. So what is the impact? What system is the liver a part of? What system is the stomach or the pancreas a part of? What system is the large intestine, the urinary, or the urinary bladder a part of? So that's where your knowledge and remembrance of that is going to come into play. If you notice here now, the two systems, one of the systems has cranial nerves that are impacted the parasympathetic division. But if you look right here, the sympathetic outflow goes from the thoracic division and it goes back up into the head. So it goes back up into the face, including the eye, the nasal mucosa, and the other glands here. So I said earlier that when you're talking about the parasympathetic division, you're largely talking about cranial nerves associated with the face. I said that's not entirely true because the sympathetic outflow also affects the face as well. The pathway getting to the face is different. So if you look at this thing right here, a plexus, a nerve fiber right here, or nerve plexus, is just a group of neurons that will merge and then separate, and they sort of illustrate the distribution of these autonomic nerve fibers. So the cranial nerves that we're talking about for the parasympathetic division include the oculomotor, facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. If you look at these here, now the oculomotor, you should remember that that's a motor nerve. The facial nerve is mixed, the glossopharyngeal nerve is a motor nerve, and then the vagus nerve is mixed. So there's a lot of mixing here. I mean, there's all motor nerves right here. Of those four nerves, the vagus nerve provides 75% approximately of the impact on the parasympathetic division of the for this. So the vagus nerve is hugely important. The one area that the vagus nerve doesn't really affect here is where these first three nerves are located, including the eye, the face, the glands of the face, including the mouth and salivary glands, and then also the tongue and things like that, where the glossopharyngeal nerves are. So otherwise, the vagus nerve is affecting all of these areas right here. And if you look at some of these things that I've underlined here, including the heart, lungs, and esophagus, here the pancreas, the small intestine, the stomach, and the gallbladder, those all go together. The colon, the urinary bladder, and reproductive organs all are impacted by the one version or the other of the vagus nerve. So this sympathetic and parasympathetic division, again, where now we have this long, if you look at this diagram right here, and this X right here means that that's cranial nerve, the vagus nerve right here, and then there's 9, 7, and 3 right there. This vagus nerve is the one that reaches all the way down and impacts virtually everything in our body. The one thing that is not listed on this is not illustrated in this diagram right here. Let me just see something here. Let me back up one thing. It's not illustrated in this diagram either. There's the urinary system at the bottom, but also the reproductive system. So there's other diagrams that I have that I used from a previous slide here. The reproductive system is also impacted by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So where my pointer is it says the urinary system and the genitalia, so that those are different systems. So there's a reproductive system and the urinary system. Those are impacted by the sacral nerves that are coming from those inferior part of the abdominal pelvic region, the pelvic region of the abdominal pelvic region. Those are impacted by the splanchnic nerves. And otherwise, again, 75% of the organs are affected by the vagus nerve. So if you just look at this list of things right here, these list of things is impacted just entirely by the vagus nerve. So a question could be, which of the following structures is not affected by the vagus nerve, or which of the following is affected by the vagus nerve? In terms of, I mentioned the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is hugely important, but it's incredibly difficult to separate the autonomic response from the enteric response. So basically the function of the enteric nervous system, there's not going to be a lot of questions on this, is to monitor the digestive tract and to control smooth muscles, but that's also the function of the autonomic nervous system, particularly the sympathetic, well, both. They are, these enteric neurons are confined to the digestive system here, and they particularly have sensory structures associated with chemoreceptors and baroreceptors. So now I talked yesterday about chemoreception in the context of smell, and I said specifically I will not ask about smell and how smell works, but I said that chemoreception also is incredibly important in sinuses associated with the heart and the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus, and that is detecting carbon dioxide concentration and pH, and then by inference the concentration of oxygen. So that's one example of chemoreception. Here's a third example of chemoreception, where the enteric neurons have sensory structures associated with the chemicals found within the digestive system. So is that chemical something that is noxious, or is it beneficial? If it's beneficial, it's going to try to get digested and then put into the plasma. If it's not, then it's going to try to get ejected from the body. When I'm talking about ejection, how fast can this happen, right? So if you know of anyone that's lactose intolerant, right, that's unable to digest something like that. Other examples are if you have allergies, so nut allergies and things like that. What is a response there? Your enteric nervous system, well, there's two things. Something coming in that you need to get rid of, there's two ways to get rid of it. Vomiting or diarrhea, depending on where it is, right, in the process, right? If it's in the stomach, it's easier to get out through vomiting. If it's later on in the digestive system, then it's easier to get it out through diarrhea, right? So in both cases, though, you're trying to get rid of that material because the chemoreceptors here sense that there's something that is going wrong. I mentioned also baroreceptors. Yesterday's discussion here, we talked about baroreceptors, these stretch receptors. When the volume is increased too much, then if you eat a big meal and then you eat a second big meal, that first big meal is going to be evacuated before that second big meal is digested. And these enteric nervous system include both sensory neurons and motor neurons. Again, now I'm not nearly as interested in this portion of the class. I'm not nearly as interested in motor neurons as I am in sensory neurons because of our discussion yesterday. So it's enough to say that these enteric motor neurons there are really focused on this smooth muscle of the and glandular muscle, glandular structure, exocrine gland of the digestive system. So one of the things that is really common about the autonomic nervous system is that the autonomic nervous system, I mentioned already about homeostasis and negative feedback. And so how is negative feedback achieved? Well, one that it's achieved is through this structure, this principle called dual innervation. So dual innervation is when you have both both divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, innervating or contacting the same structure, and one causes it to increase in activity and the other causes it to decrease. So the names themselves, they're these sort of easy to remember things. Rest and digest or fight or flight response. The sympathetic division is the fight or flight response. It's going to be causing some structures to increase in activity, and then the parasympathetic division will cause those same structures to decrease in activity. And so as a result, here, we're able to maintain homeostasis by this principle of dual innervation. When you're talking about dual innervation, most organs are dually innervated, but not all. I will focus on the organs that are dually innervated. So if you look at, this is a list of some of the impacts of dual innervation of the, or innervation associated. Some of them do not have innervation, and that is a function of just the one division or the other. And so here's an example here. So that if you look at lipid breakdown and largely where are lipids found? Well, the lipids are found associated with skeletal muscle, superficial to skeletal muscle, and elsewhere. But skeletal muscle then is associated with the sympathetic division, so that fight or flight response. So that if you're trying to get energy for muscles here, one store of energy is superficial lipids, and lipids are broken down in the mitochondria, as you all know. So adipose tissue is affected by the sympathetic division. Adipose, these other things here, if you look at all of these arterioles associated with carrying blood to tissues, and if you look at the word arteriole, I won't ask you to distinguish an arteriole from an artery, but an artery in general brings blood to a structure. So the heart, kidneys, lungs, and skeletal muscle is delivering blood to those muscles, and those are arteries, or small arteries are arterioles, and they cause the constriction. So the sympathetic division causes constriction. So that if it's constricting, then the parasympathetic doesn't need to do anything. In other words, if the blood is flowing to these individual organs, then the parasympathetic division doesn't have any activity. And so as a result, on the right-hand side, these things, it's not to say that the parasympathetic division doesn't affect these organs at all, but in the context of these blood tissues, of the arterioles, the parasympathetic doesn't affect it. So the sympathetic division does affect the arterioles, and then the venules, a small vein is a venule. It does cause, it does affect veins too. So in that first case, when you're talking about blood flow to a structure, what is the possible activity, or what is the possible consequence of that? Either increase blood flow to that activity by constricting the blood flow in those arterioles, and removing blood from that tissue through contracting of the skeletal muscle and the veins or the venules, or slow it down. And so that case here, it's sort of like if you're driving on the road and you press on the gas pedal, you're going to be accelerating. But if you take your foot off the gas pedal, you're still moving forward. The blood is still moving in your body. It's just not moving as fast. So the parasympathetic division isn't needed there. But if you look here in this list here, you can see that the individual organs here in the pupil of the eye, the adrenal glands and gastric glands, salivary and pancreas glands here, sweat glands here. Some of these things are dually innervated, and it's these functions here that are dually innervated that are most interesting. So we'll start with the eye. There are a series of muscles associated with the eye, and if I were to take one of you and turn on my flashlight and put a flashlight in your eye, right? What would happen to the pupil? Would it get real wide, or would it get real small? It would get real small. It would constrict, right? And so there's less light being allowed into the eye. And if it's dark out, then the pupils will dilate and get bigger. The sympathetic division is also called the fight or flight division, so that if you're in an emergency and you're trying to deal with this emergency, and you want to get as much information about this emergency as you can, your pupils are going to dilate so that there's as much information getting to your brain as you can. Conversely, the same muscles there are cause constriction in the parasympathetic division. So if you look at this part right here, the reverse is true here. Now, I've labeled a couple of, I've bolded a few of these organs here. So the gastric gland is associated with the stomach, and gastric secretion is fairly complex, and so I'm not going to necessarily worry about that, but there are glands that will either cause, the parasympathetic division will cause increased gastric secretion, and the sympathetic division decreased gastric secretion. So generally speaking, if you're in a fight and you're in an emergency, you're not worried about what you're going to have for lunch. And so that's true there. That same is true for the salivary gland. If you're in a fight and you're in an emergency, your mouth will get dry, as opposed to when you're eating, like when you're eating Thanksgiving dinner, your mouth was really had lots of saliva and was getting ready to eat all this stuff. So most of these glands, except for the one that I'm about to talk about, are just either exocrine glands or endocrine glands here. And I'm not really focusing on endocrine glands at all, but except in this case, the pancreas. The pancreas is a combination of both exocrine and endocrine glands. And so if you look at this, don't get confused here. So insulin secretion, exocrine secretion, those are different. Insulin is a hormone. Insulin, these exocrine glands, so there's parts of the pancreas that secrete glands via exocrine systems, and then other parts secreted through a hormonal system or endocrine system. In both cases, the sympathetic causes the pancreas to decrease, and the parasympathetic causes it to increase secretion. So what does that mean? Why would I ask that? I might throw in a question about the endocrine system here, and this is where the endocrine system will be referred to. In terms of sweat, when you're highly active, then you're trying to cool your body down, and so it's not unreasonable to see that the sympathetic division is going to be impacted there, and the parasympathetic is not. So when I talk about the generalities of dual innervation make sense, but now I'm giving you some examples there where so the eye, the gastric gland, and so on. These examples are where, some examples where there's dual innervation, other examples like in sweat where there's not dual innervation or blood flow. The last thing here is the one that is easily the most important portion of and I can't believe I forgot about it, the sympathetic division here is the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is adjacent to but different from the urinary system, and it sits right on top of the kidney. And so if you look at diagrams there's this little, if this is the kidney, it looks like there's a little ball of fat that sits on top of the kidney, and that's called the adrenal gland. There's a ton of blood flow that goes to the kidney, going to and from the kidney, and if there's an emergency, epinephrine or norepinephrine, which is increasing your activity levels, will be released from the adrenal gland into the bloodstream, and then that causes the things to happen very quickly. Again, the parasympathetic division doesn't cause that to release, so there's no impact there. In terms of dual innervation, here are examples of dual innervation. Here we have the heart rate that the parasympathetic division is increased and sympathetic division is decreased. It causes the heart rate to decrease in contraction. Rate and volume, intensity, strength, all of those things is an impact of the parasympathetic division. When you see the word, if I mention the word glucose, and we're talking about, I mentioned lipid digestion or lipid breakdown. Lipid breakdown, lipids are, or adipose tissue is adjacent to muscles. It takes a little while for those muscles to break, for mitochondria to break down lipids because they're complicated and they're big. So what is the immediate response to an emergency? Well, the immediate response to emergency is, number one, is use up any stores of ATP. Now, we're in the muscles here, so now I know that you all are gonna remember that there's other stores of ATP and there's other stores of oxygen. So we can talk about additional stores of myoglobin here. I could mention that. I could mention other stores of oxygen. There's creatine. Creatine phosphate is a way to store ATP temporarily as sort of an additional gas tank, if you will. And then finally, relatively quickly, we can have the digestion of glucose. Where does the glucose get broken down most quickly, or get separated from the larger molecules here, and that happens in the liver. So that if there's a stressful situation where you're using a lot of energy and it's taking a little while, then the liver is going to start working and it's going to start releasing glucose into the blood, and then that blood will be flowing to those tissues that need it, and then those tissues will use it, those muscles will use it. So the glucose is impacted during the sympathetic division, that's released into the blood. Lungs are another example of increase or constriction of airway passages. Means that your heart rate and your breathing rate is going to slow down, so that rest and digest after you eat a large meal, you're going to be more likely to take a nap. So you start breathing much less deeply, and slowly, and then you just sort of start, like I do all the time, take a nap. The opposite is true too in both skeletal muscles and sex organs. Erection and ejaculation are associated with the sympathetic division, along with breakdown of glucose and glycogen, associated with the sympathetic division. This term glycogen is another one that I can talk about here in particular, and glycogen in particular is a large macromolecule that stores glucose in complicated ways. That glycogen, when it's broken down to glucose, and that glucose then is used by skeletal muscles. And this last part right here, the urinary system. Generally speaking, the urinary system is increased during the parasympathetic and not during the sympathetic. So I could ask you, what are some of the impacts of the respiratory system, the lungs, the heart, arteries, arterioles? What are some of those impacted by one system or another? I could ask you questions about cranial nerves and where are they going to impact the body. All of those things in the context of the autonomic nervous system. So all those things, there's a lot of overlap between previous structures for previous questions, previous part of the body that we've studied already, and this system right here. Another overlap is the context of neurotransmitters, and you know that neurotransmitters, we encountered neurotransmitters first in Unit 3 in the form of acetylcholine, and neurotransmitters at neuromuscular junctions, we said that neurotransmitters are released by that across the synaptic cleft there, and it goes to the skeletal muscle here. Acetylcholine is released in general. Acetylcholine is an incredibly important neurotransmitter. It's released by these individual neurons, and we haven't talked about this especially. Cholinergic neurons are examples of neurons that release acetylcholine. And here are some examples of where they're located, either preganglionic, postganglionic neurons. But acetylcholine is incredibly important in terms of neurotransmitter. Another form of a neuron, and now when I talk about these different types of neurons here, I'm not talking about the shape of the neuron, the structure of the neuron, or anything. The only thing we're talking about is what they're releasing. And adrenergic neurons are ones releasing with norepinephrine and epinephrine. So these are most postsympathetic neurons here. And so these sympathetic neurons are going to be adrenergic. There's less clarity between cholinergic neurons. because cholinergic neurons are abundant all throughout the body. There are other examples of neurotransmitters, and if you look at this list right here, so here is some examples. So gastrin, as the term gastrin refers to digestive system, so that you can automatically say that if you're releasing gastrin, then you're part of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division. Well, gastric juices is associated with the digestion here. So automatically you should say yourself that gastrin is associated with the parasympathetic division. Two other important neurotransmitters include dopamine and serotonin, and they largely have opposite effects on the body, and those are examples too. After the neurotransmitters are released, they have to go somewhere, and if they go, where do they go? They have to go to receptors. So these cholinergic neurons there are ones that are releasing acetylcholine, and they have these receptors that come in two different forms. There's nicotinic and muscarinic receptors here. So these nicotinic receptors here are generally found in skeletal muscles, and so which division is going to be active and have a lot of nicotinic receptors here? Well, that would be the sympathetic division. The muscarinic effectors there, or receptors rather, are going to be, generally speaking, both in the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So the sweat glands are part of the sympathetic division. Other effectors, generally speaking, is the parasympathetic division. So muscarinic is general. Nicotinic receptors are largely skeletal muscle. That's the most important part there. Adrenergic receptors are largely just a function of the sympathetic division. They bind and looking for epinephrine or norepinephrine. These things are going to then cause interaction, all the consequent increase in blood flow, respirating rate, heart rate, etc. So these adrenergic reactions are largely looking for epinephrine and norepinephrine. There's also ways that drugs can affect the autonomic nervous system. So they can be, if you're an agonist or an antagonist here, an antagonist will be preventing a binding of a receptor, so preventing activation, and an agonist will be enhancing the activation of a neuron. And when I say activation here, if that is a neuron, if that's a digestive system, a digestive process, if it's the pancreas, if whatever it is that the target here. If it's an agonist, it's going to increase the activity. If it's an antagonist, it's going to reduce the activity. So the classic example of dual innervation is part of the cardiovascular system. And so if you're looking at the cardiovascular system right here, this part right here is part of the parasympathetic division. And this part right here is the sympathetic division. And in both cases, it's getting to the heart, and it's sensing structures from the heart. And if you look right here, this part right here is the carotid sinus, and then there's also the aortic sinus right here. The carotid sinus have baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, and so what are they going to be sensing? They're going to be sensing either the volume or the chemistry. Which of the nerves are we worried about here? In the parasympathetic division, it's the vagus nerve. Once again, if you're talking about the parasympathetic division and you're talking about anywhere within the abdominal pelvic region, just guess the vagus nerve. The sympathetic division here is going to go into a different accelerator here, or a different process, a different pathway. It gets out of the brain there, and it goes to the sympathetic nerves and those sympathetic ganglion, and then there's these heart rate accelerators. So those heart rate accelerators cause an increase in both heart rate and contraction strength, and that causes blood flow to increase, and then it consequently is elsewhere in the body as well. So if you look at some of these things now, some of these things are higher on the left-hand side, especially the limbic system and the cerebrum, the hypothalamus. Those things are impacting general parts of the brain that we've already talked about. Emotions and thoughts can impact the autonomic nervous system either negatively or positively. If you're stressed out, you might have, if an individual is stressed out, they might have a reaction to a specific food type, or they might say that they're not hungry. If they're as in, other people will have a different reaction, right? They might be really, really hungry or the same response to that same system here, that same thought or emotion. That hypothalamus, remember, that's the integrating system here, and that hypothalamus has a huge number of impacts on the body. There's, I think I listed 9 impacts of the hypothalamus on the body, and so this is where we can talk about the regulation of the autonomic nervous system and the brain, and again, it's really complicated here. And then the brainstem is really pretty straightforward right here. So. So I talked a little bit about dual innervation here, and dual innervation, let me just kind of just stop 1 second here. Let me just see one thing here. I just want to see where this is going. Oh, okay. What? Okay. So this idea of dual innervation is the key component of the autonomic nervous system. Most organs, when they're duly innervated, these structures, these systems have opposite effects, as I've said. When they have opposite effects, the 2 divisions then will either increase or decrease the activity of it. So if you're looking at sexual reproduction, if you're looking at digestion, if you're looking at respiration, all of those things can either cause one to increase or to decrease. Other cases here, when you're talking about blood flow to a tissue, to the muscular system, to the skeletal muscular system, the sympathetic division will increase it, but the parasympathetic division will not. So in that case, the muscular system or blood flow doesn't necessarily is not impacted by the parasympathetic division, so it would not be an example of dual innervation. Generally speaking here, when you're talking about the autonomic nervous system, if there's impact generally or locally here, parasympathetic divisions is more local and it's more focused on the particularly the abdominal pelvic region. The sympathetic division, by its impact by the hormones releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, is body-wide. So generally it leads to widespread effects. That's more a more general impact. So I've talked about the autonomic nervous system. I've talked about the various parts of it, the structure of it. We talked about the hormones associated with it, the neurotransmitters rather associated with it. I mentioned a couple of examples of organs that are either dual innervated or not dual innervated. A key component of the autonomic nervous system is dual innervation, but that doesn't always, that's not universal. One example of dual innervation is clearly the heart, the cardiovascular system, in particular the heart and the lung, the respiratory system. So dual innervation is there, but dual innervation is not present necessarily in the circulatory system, especially getting to muscles, so skeletal muscles. Generally speaking, we talk about the differences between these 2 sympathetic and parasympathetic effects. So, what I've just done, you look at the schedule, we're supposed to have class tomorrow. I am done talking. Not only for today, I'm done talking for the semester.
What?
Today?
This was our last lecture?
Why do you break the news so late?
I thought we were gonna be here tomorrow.
So, what I will do tomorrow, so I always have I have a little bit of a pad so I can modify the class a little bit, right? And try to keep it on schedule. So I built in that because we have so much time together. I built in that time today. So as it worked out, tomorrow is a review. I will be here tomorrow. If you're not here, you're gonna be marked present. If you are here, you're gonna be marked present. If Rochelle's here, I'm gonna say good morning, Rochelle. That's that will be the last day that I'll say it here. So I'm done talking. Class is over here. I really want to thank you guys for, this is my first time that I've ever lectured to a group of Ryan students this large in this system, right, with this class, because normally we used to much smaller classes. I hope you enjoyed this. There's a couple more things to go. One, I was walking up the stairs with Gianna, and I said two things to Gianna. First is, you're weird because you're one of the only students who walk up the stairs. And as I'm walking up the stairs, so I'm not calling her weird because I'm doing the same thing. But the other thing I said to her is that less than a week to go, push through one more week and then you get a break, right? Then you can sleep. Don't give up now, right? So exam 5 on Monday, mini practical this week. By the way, the mini practical and the exam 5 go more or less together, right? The brain. The following week, next week on Monday is exam 5, and then Thursday or Friday is the mini practical, is the final practical, and then you are done. Okay. Any questions from you? So once again, now tomorrow's Wednesday. Guess what I'm going to tell Ms. Vininger about your CCR class?
They should be in class.
Really? Would I ever say that to her?
Wait,
Yes,
right
I
now,
would.
today?
Excuse me?
Don't be this way.
I absolutely will be this way. So my daughter is super stressed out about getting all her stupid tests done, her projects done, and her college stuff done. I know that you guys are super stressed out about that too. CCR is helpful. She actually is like, Dad, I really wish I came to your school. I was like, honey, if you did, it would be so awesome. I would be bugging the shit out of you so much. And she's like, yeah, actually, I'm not gonna. I'm glad I don't.
Well, you wouldn't be able to teach her though, right? Like, she wouldn't be able to be in this class because she's your child.
I don't know. I never really concerned me. A number of years ago, I was teaching here, and I was teaching URI this and that, the anatomy physiology class, and my nephew was here at URI, and he was like, "Hey, Uncle Mike, there's someone named Clancy teaching, Michael Clancy teaching that. Do you know him?" I was like, "Yeah, Justin, it's me." And he's like, "Really? I gotta take that class." And I was like, "Well, I don't know if you can, Jay." And it turns out he wasn't. He was a conventional student, not a high school student, so he couldn't take it. So I never really asked that question. But I told Justin that if since we have both the same names, that it would be a little bit different, right? But
What are the odds?
Right. But if my daughter is a hyphenated name, Hagopian Clancy is her full name. I said, so what you should do is don't use the Clancy part, and I'll just give you an A for the class. And she's like, really? I'm like, no. But anyway, I enjoyed this class. I hope you did too. I hope you learned a little bit. If you guys have any questions for me, please stick around. If you have anything to make up, please stick around. Otherwise, you guys can go. And